In this video, we will look at the complement system and at natural killer cells. So let's start with the complement system. It is a system of proteins in the blood, and here it is. What you need to know about the complement system is what it does and how it is triggered. What you could do if you wanted would be learn all the different proteins in the blood and how they interact with each other. These are just the complement proteins. There's C3 convertase, C3A and B, C5A, like blah blah, who cares? They're just proteins in the blood that are ready to do things. And I want you to know what triggers them, and I want you to know what they do. And that's on this slide, but it's also on this slide. So you can choose to learn how it's triggered or activated using the technical names, which are the alternative pathway, the classical pathway, and that MBL or mannan-binding lectin pathway. But I also want you to maybe instead be able to use language that translates that into something we understand. So here's how I would tend to write it less formally and more truthfully. So these are triggers of the complement system. So let's look at how it's turned on before we look at what it does, and that's fine. So one of them is going to be antibody binding. So if something in the bloodstream has antibodies stuck to it, that will trigger the complement cascade, we call it. That will trigger the complement system. And that is the classical pathway. That is this pathway. And it's adaptive. Antibodies are as adaptive as something can be. They're randomly generated. We don't know what they do until we find the one that does what we want. So this is completely, what's the word? Completely adaptive. The other two are innate. And basically, this one, the alternative pathway, is triggered by certain bacterial PAMPs in the bloodstream. So if you remember what that is, you know what I'm talking about. If not, go look it up because it's important. So again, that's called the alternative pathway, but I don't care about that. And then this is completely innate because PAMPs are an innate thing. We can hard code into our DNA ways to detect proteins we expect to see. And PAMPs are proteins we expect to see if we're being attacked by bacteria or viruses or fungi or whatever, as much as we can. As much as we can predict, pretty much we have receptors for them. For what we can't predict, we have the adaptive immune system. So then the third thing are going to be fungal and protist PAMPs. Those are going to be the mannans, and it's a type of sugar, and we have a protein in the blood that binds, if it sees that type of sugar, which is a PAMP, it binds to it, and that can trigger the complement system. So I would accept these three exactly as written instead of these three, which are the technical names, but don't tell you anything about them. So then what does it do? What does the complement system do? Well, really, this is what it does. They initiate inflammation, they opsonize pathogens for phagocytosis, and they can lyse some bacteria directly. And so the slides kind of go through all that. This is a diagram of the complement proteins self-assembling in a bacterial cell membrane to form a pore, and that kills the cell. So this is the membrane attack complex. You don't need to know that, but that is what this is called, and that's one of the things the complement system can do. It can lyse some bacteria directly, and that's actually where it got the name complement, because people who discovered antibodies realized that if they put antibodies in blood with bacteria, the bacteria would die. And they're like, oh, this is a complement to the antibody, and it kills bacteria. The antibodies don't, but the complement does. So that's cool. So that is the classical pathway. It's the antibody binding. And then the bacterial PAMP is the alternative pathway. All right, enough of this. Let's look at natural killer cells. So natural killer cells. These have a specific function, and to understand it, let's revisit cytotoxic T cells. Cytotoxic T cells are lymphocytes, so they have randomly generated T cell receptors, like all T cells do. I can't draw. Or, you know, I drew that one, but I could just as easily have drawn this one. So the way I drew them is just trying to show you that their T cell receptors have different shapes and are going to detect different things. So we have a billion different cytotoxic T cells, and we ideally find one that can recognize the viral proteins, like the capsid proteins from whatever virus is infecting us, or the spike proteins, or even the enzymes from that are made inside the infected cell. And if we have that, cytotoxic T cells, again, they will look at proteins displayed on MHC1. So go back and think about MHC1. What does it display? MHC1 displays random cytoplasmic proteins. So cells just randomly pick proteins from their cytoplasm, put them on MHC1, and show them to cytotoxic T cells. And that's how they can ask, hey, are you looking for this protein that's inside me? Because if so, kill me, because I'm a virion factory, or maybe I'm cancerous. And that's what cytotoxic T cells do. They look at proteins displayed on MHC1, and if they recognize those proteins, they kill the cell. So, what do natural killer cells do? They kill any host cell that does not display MHC1. Okay, so what's the logic here? Why would we want cells to do that? Some viruses will shut down MHC1, the system. They won't let cells load proteins onto MHC1 to display it. They won't let cells make MHC1. They'll interfere with it somehow. That's a typical, very common virus strategy. Influenza definitely does this. So, when influenza starts infecting respiratory epithelial cells, they will stop displaying MHC1. So they're going to be invisible to cytotoxic T cells. So our only hope against these virion factories are the natural killer cells that recognize that this has happened and kill these virion factories. Later in an immune response, we really rely on cytotoxic T cells to find every virion factory and kill it. Early in an immune response, natural killer cells are often the first line of defense. So against influenza, these are the first line of defense. If you don't already have antibodies to block viral attachment, you need natural killer cells that are going to find the virion factories and kill them.